There are days that carve themselves into a person's soul, days where the weight of life presses down so hard it becomes difficult to breathe. For Emma, that day started with nothing but a desperate prayer on her lips and her baby's burning body in her arms. It wasn't just cold outside. It was a kind of cold that made her bones ache and her hope flicker like a dying candle. But none of that mattered. Not the wind biting her skin. Not the sharp gravel cutting into her bare feet. Not the looks people might give her if they saw her running like a mad woman toward the edge of town. What mattered was Lily, that 8-month-old baby girl whose fever had turned her skin boiling hot, whose breathing had become so faint it sounded like it might just fade into silence. Emma had nothing left. No family, no money, and certainly no time. The village was too small for doctors or hospitals. Every second felt like death creeping closer, and it was in that moment, clutching her limp child and whispering promises through sobs, that she remembered something. Marston Ranch. It was 2 miles out, owned by a man she'd only ever seen from afar, but she'd heard things, that he had resources, that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance. So she ran, not because she was strong, but because she had no choice. She ran like a woman possessed, like every step could be the difference between holding her daughter one more night or burying her before her first birthday. And with each stride, the world faded away. It became only her dying baby, and the wild, deafening silence of a world that didn't seem to care. Until maybe, just maybe, it did. By the time she reached the gates of the ranch, Emma's legs were shaking so badly she nearly collapsed. The massive wooden entrance loomed in front of her, carved with the letter M in the center, looking more like a wall than a welcome. Her fist hit it with all the strength she could summon. "Please!" she screamed over and over, her voice cracking. Raw. "My baby, someone help me." There was no reply at first, just the howling wind and her own labored breathing. For one terrifying second, Emma truly thought no one would come. She imagined herself standing there, screaming into the void, while Lily took her last breath against her chest. But then, a sound. Footsteps. Heavy. Fast. The gate creaked open and there he was, John Marston. Taller than she remembered, eyes sharper than they looked from afar, and in that second, her whole body threatened to give out. She held Lily out with trembling arms. "She's burning," she choked out, words barely escaping her lips. "I don't know what to do." She didn't need to say more. He took one look at the baby, flushed face, eyes half shut, body limp, and something in him shifted. "Come with me," he said firmly, already turning toward the garage. Emma stumbled after him, clutching Lily as the wind whipped through her hair. Seconds later they were in his truck, the engine roaring to life, tires tearing through the dirt as John drove like a man on a mission. In the rearview mirror, his eyes flicked to them constantly. "Is she still breathing?" he asked. Emma pressed her hand to Lily's chest, feeling the shallow, fragile rise and fall. "Barely," she whispered. "She's so weak. I think I'm losing her." And in that moment, John just said, "We're going to make it. I promise." The drive felt endless, even though John's truck tore through the back roads like it was on fire. Every bump in the road made Emma flinch, not for herself, but for the tiny body cradled in her arms that seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. Lily's cries had faded into soft whimpers, and even those were getting weaker. Emma was terrified of silence, terrified that at any moment she might look down and see her daughter still, lifeless. She whispered to her constantly, voice cracking, "Hold on, baby. Mommy's here. You're going to be okay." The headlights illuminated the narrow road ahead, cutting through the early evening fog. The rain started slow, just a few drops, but it brought with it the smell of wet earth and a sense of urgency. John's jaw was tight, his knuckles white around the steering wheel, and though he said nothing more for a long time, everything about his body screamed urgency. Emma had never felt more helpless. Her whole world was unraveling in that cab, and the man she barely knew was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the words almost swallowed by her trembling breath. "You don't even know me." He didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the road, but his voice came low and steady. "Because no one should go through this alone." That one sentence cut through the fear, wrapped around her like a blanket. It wasn't about knowing her, it was about doing the right thing. And at that moment, when her whole world was coming apart, it was the only thing that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone after all. The hospital came into view like a beacon in the night, a small building with flickering lights that somehow held all of Emma's hopes inside its sterile walls. John didn't even slow as he pulled into the parking lot, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. Before the engine had even stopped, he jumped out, racing around the truck to help Emma out. She stumbled as her feet hit the ground, her legs nearly giving out under the weight of panic and exhaustion. "Come on," John urged, his voice firm but not harsh. "Let's go." A nurse at the entrance caught sight of them and ran over with a pediatric stretcher, calling for help. Emma laid Lily down gently, and the sight of her baby so still, not crying anymore, was more horrifying than any scream. "Please," Emma begged, her voice cracking as she clung to the stretcher. "She's burning up. She can't breathe." The medical team sprang into action, checking vitals, pushing buttons, shouting terms Emma didn't understand. She stood frozen, watching it all like she was underwater. John stayed beside her, his presence solid, steady. When the doctor mentioned sepsis and fluid in Lily's lungs, Emma felt like the ground had vanished beneath her. "She needs emergency surgery," he said, "now." And all Emma could say was, "I don't have money. I don't have insurance." Her knees buckled, and she would have hit the floor if John hadn't caught her. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. "Do it," he told the doctor. "I'll pay. Everything." The moment he said those words, Emma turned to him, eyes wide, breathless. "You can't, I can't." But he just looked at her and said, "This isn't charity. It's what's right." And somehow, in that moment, it was. Emma stood frozen in place, watching the medical team wheel Lily away through the double doors that slammed shut with a finality that shook her to her core. Her legs gave out, and she dropped to her knees, right there in the hallway, hands covering her face, sobs erupting from a place so deep it felt like she was being torn in half. "My baby," she cried, her voice hoarse, barely audible, like the words were being dragged from her chest by some invisible force. She couldn't stop shaking. Her body trembled like a leaf in a storm, and for a moment, it felt like her soul was being ripped apart. But John didn't leave her. He knelt beside her, wrapping one strong arm around her shoulders, grounding her, like an anchor in a stormy sea. "You're stronger than you think, Emma," he said gently, his deep voice a surprising contrast to the chaos around them. She clutched his arm like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Her eyes were red, swollen, her voice barely held together. "But what if she doesn't make it?" she whispered, her fear spilling out. "What if I lose her?" The thought alone was unbearable, and she felt like her chest might cave in. "She's all I have." John didn't respond. Immediately, he shut his eyes, breathed deeply, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet strength that hit her right in the heart. "You won't lose her. Not today. I promise you." There was something in the way he said it. Not just words, but conviction. A vow that felt like it had weight behind it, as if it had been forged in his own pain. And that's when Emma realized he knew this kind of fear. He knew it too well. They waited in the sterile white room, surrounded by the humming of machines, the cold glow of fluorescent lights, and the deafening silence of uncertainty. Emma sat in a plastic chair, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around them like she was trying to hold herself together. She rocked gently, a motion she didn't even realize she was doing, a subconscious attempt to soothe the unbearable ache pulsing in her chest. John sat beside her, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor, jaw clenched, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Neither of them spoke. There wasn't anything to say that could make it better. Time dragged like it was moving through molasses. Every second that passed felt like an hour. Every footstep down the hall, every voice from a distant room made Emma jump. But when the door finally opened and the doctor stepped in, Emma's breath caught in her throat. He looked tired, his surgical cap still on, but his eyes held something she hadn't dared hope for. Relief. "The surgery was a success," he said, voice calm and clear. "We drained the fluid and stabilized her. She's not out of the woods yet, but she's going to be okay." Emma broke. Her body collapsed into sobs so heavy they shook her entire frame. She covered her face, crying from somewhere so raw it was almost primal. John reached out, took her hand, and gave it a firm squeeze. "See?" he said softly. "You're not alone. Neither of you are." And in that moment, for the first time in what felt like forever, Emma believed it. Not just in what he said, but in something deeper, something she couldn't explain but could feel, and that was enough. 4 days later, the early morning sun filtered through the hospital window, casting a warm golden light across the pale walls. It was quiet, except for the soft beeping of the heart monitor, which now felt like a song of hope rather than dread. Lily was stable. Her small chest rose and fell with calm, rhythmic breaths. Her skin, once flushed with fever, had returned to its usual gentle tone. Though still weak and fragile, she was alive. Emma sat beside her daughter's bed, watching her sleep. Every tiny sound, every movement, a reminder of how close she'd come to losing her. Her hands hovered over Lily's little body like they were afraid to touch her, to wake her, to disturb the fragile peace that had finally returned. The doctor came in with discharge papers and a soft smile, confirming it was time to go home. That word, home, hit Emma like a weight. She packed Lily carefully, placing the thin pink blanket around her small form and gently lifting her into her arms. The hallway felt endless as she walked out of the hospital, her feet dragging slightly, as if fear still clung to her ankles. But then she saw him, John, leaning against his truck, arms crossed, looking right at her. The moment their eyes met, something shifted. She thought about walking past him, about saying thank you and continuing alone. But he uncrossed his arms, shook his head slightly. "Don't even think about it," he said, voice low, firm. "You and Lily are not going home alone." Emma froze just a few steps from the truck, hugging Lily closer. Her heart caught between pride and something far more vulnerable. Emma looked at him, at the man who had already done so much, and tried to summon the strength to say no. "John," she began, her voice low, soft, almost unsure. "You've already done more than enough. I can't accept more. It's not fair." Her words trembled with that mix of resistance and gratitude, the kind born from years of having to carry too much alone. But John didn't flinch. He stepped toward her slowly, the way someone approaches a skittish animal, not to startle, but to reassure. "Look at me," he said. And when she did, she saw it, the sincerity in his eyes, the kind of care that didn't come from pity but from something deeper. "This isn't charity," he said. "This is my choice. I want to help. I choose to help." And there was no anger in his voice, no pride, just a steady calm that made her feel safer than she had in years. Emma blinked back the tears that threatened to fall again. Something in her softened, not because she was giving up, but because for the first time in so long, someone wasn't trying to save her. They were just standing beside her, ready to carry some of the weight. She glanced down at Lily, then back at John. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Okay, but just until she's better." He smiled just slightly, the corners of his mouth tugging upward in that understated way that made it clear this meant more to him than he let on. "That's all I'm asking," he said. And with that, he opened the truck door and helped her inside. The drive back wasn't filled with words, but with something else entirely. Quiet understanding, like they had both stepped into a new chapter they hadn't seen coming. The ride to the ranch was wrapped in silence, but it wasn't an awkward kind. It was the kind that settled over two people who didn't need to talk to understand each other. Emma sat by the window, holding Lily close, watching the landscape roll past like a dream she didn't dare wake from. Fields stretched wide, golden and endless, while trees swayed gently in the wind. And somewhere inside her, something stirred, a quiet knowing that her life somehow was changing in ways she couldn't explain yet. When the truck turned the corner and the ranch came into view, she held her breath. She had never really looked at it before, not closely. The house stood proud but not grand, built from rustic wood and painted a soft beige that blended perfectly with the land around it. The garden out front was bursting with life, sunflowers, lavender, daisies, all swaying as if they too were welcoming her. A wide porch stretched across the front of the house, its rocking chairs gently moving in the wind, white curtains billowing behind them like whispers of forgotten peace. Farther back, she saw the red barn, fences perfectly aligned, an orchard, heavy with fruit. It looked like something out of a place that had never known pain. Emma stepped down from the truck, Lily cradled against her chest, and for a moment she just stood there, overwhelmed. She didn't know if it was the exhaustion or the surreal beauty of it all, but she felt something tight in her chest ease. Just a little. John watched her, arms crossed, and when he spoke, it was almost as if he could read her mind. "Yeah," he said, nodding at the land. "Takes a lot of work to keep it running." And then, with a softer tone, he added, "Come on, I'll show you where you'll be staying." Inside the house, everything smelled of warmth, fresh wood, coffee that had been brewed earlier that morning, and something else she couldn't quite name, like home-baked bread and history. The wooden floors creaked softly beneath their steps, and the walls were lined with old paintings and black and white photos, snapshots of lives long lived and stories half told. It was the kind of place where you could feel the past lingering in the air, not haunting it, but holding it steady. John led her upstairs, showing her to a room with fresh sheets, a clean crib already waiting in the corner, and windows that looked out over the orchard. He moved around the room in silence, opening windows, checking the light, fluffing pillows, little things that told her he cared more than he let on. Emma stood in the doorway for a long moment, Lily asleep in her arms, taking it all in. Then something caught her eye above the fireplace in the living room downstairs. A portrait. A woman with wavy brown hair and kind eyes stood in a field of flowers, smiling like she was caught in the middle of a laugh. Emma found herself drawn to it. She walked closer, her voice just a whisper. "She's beautiful," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. Behind her, John's voice came quiet and heavy. "My wife," he said. "Sheena. She passed 3 years ago." And just like that, everything made sense. The way he carried himself, the silence that sometimes filled the air between his words. Emma turned slowly, Lily still sleeping against her chest. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I know what it's like to lose someone." Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, a quiet understanding passed between them. Of grief, of survival, of things too heavy for words. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, tucked safely into the crib in the corner of their guest room, Emma stood by the window for a long time. The moon hung low over the orchard, casting silver shadows over the trees. The ranch was quiet, peaceful in a way she hadn't known in years. But inside her chest, the weight of everything, what had happened, what she was feeling, what she didn't know how to say, pressed in. She thought about Sheena, about the portrait with that glowing smile. She thought about John's voice when he'd said her name, how it had cracked just a little, how he hadn't had to say much for her, to know that pain still lived deep inside him. And she thought about how strange it was to be here now, in this place that wasn't hers, but felt more like home than anywhere had since she lost her husband. That grief had shaped her. It had hardened her edges, made her hesitant, guarded. But standing there, watching the quiet life outside, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Safe. Not because the world had stopped being dangerous, but because someone had made space for her in theirs, without asking for anything in return. And that, being seen, being cared for without conditions, that was new. She pressed her forehead gently against the cool window pane, eyes closing as she whispered into the dark, "Thank you." Whether it was to John, or to fate, or to something higher, she didn't know. All she knew was she wasn't numb anymore, and for the first time in so long, she didn't want to run. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm, like nature itself had paused to let healing settle in. Emma, still tired but growing stronger, found herself easing into life at the ranch without meaning to. What started as small gestures, helping gather fruit from the orchard, folding laundry, watching over the hens, soon turned into something more natural, like muscle memory she didn't know she had. She moved through the house like she belonged, not because she had claimed it, but because somehow it had claimed her. John was different too. He hadn't said much, hadn't pushed or pried, but he was there, always. He would walk in from the fields, boots muddy, shirt clinging to his back, but the moment Lily cried, he'd drop everything. No hesitation, no delay. He would walk over, scoop her into his arms with those big hands, and cradle her like she was made of porcelain and stardust. "And who's the prettiest little lady on this farm?" he'd whisper, his deep voice turning light, almost goofy. Emma watched him from the kitchen doorway one afternoon, a dish towel forgotten in her hands, as he twirled Lily in the air, and she laughed, a high-pitched, pure sound that seemed to wash the entire house in light. And something happened inside Emma in that moment. Her heart did something strange. It skipped, then swelled, and she couldn't quite catch her breath. She looked away quickly, blinking fast, like that could push down whatever had just risen in her chest. "It's not love," she whispered to herself, almost angrily. "It's just gratitude." But even as she said it, the words tasted like a lie. And deep down, a part of her already knew the truth she wasn't ready to admit. As the days continued to pass, the routines on the ranch became less foreign and more comforting, like Emma had unknowingly stepped into a life that had been waiting for her all along. She started waking up early to bake bread, her hands remembering movements they hadn't made in years. The smell of dough rising, of butter melting over warm crusts, filled the house with something that felt like peace. She fed the chickens, gathered apples from the orchard with Lily strapped to her chest, and made small jokes with the ranch hands who, over time, stopped seeing her as a guest and started calling her by name. John remained a constant, solid, dependable, but there were moments when Emma caught glimpses of something softer behind his usual stoicism. He'd brush dust off her shoulder after she came in from the orchard, or casually leave her favorite tea on the counter without a word. He never made it feel like a big deal, and maybe that's why it mattered so much. It wasn't grand gestures. It was presence, steady, undemanding, and the way he looked at Lily, like she was his, like she belonged in his arms, only deepened the quiet storm building inside Emma. She caught herself watching him too long, smiling too easily, and every night, when she tucked Lily into the crib and stood in the quiet house listening to the creak of the porch swing outside, she'd feel it, this invisible thread, tying her to something she hadn't dared hope for. Something like a second chance, but she still couldn't say it out loud, couldn't admit to herself that this life, the one that didn't feel borrowed anymore, might actually be hers. Then one afternoon, John appeared at the kitchen door, his hat in his hands, eyes hesitant in a way Emma had never seen before. "Thought maybe you'd want to walk around the ranch," he said, voice a little awkward. "See more of it. I realized I haven't really shown you." Emma looked up from the dough she'd been kneading and felt something flutter in her chest. She wiped her hands, nodded, and placed Lily into her stroller with practiced ease. "I'd like that," she replied, her voice softer than usual. They walked side by side along the gravel path, their steps unconsciously in sync. John showed her the wheat fields, the horses grazing on the far hills, the spot where the sunrise hit just right in the early morning. It was all beautiful, but what struck Emma most wasn't the land. It was the way he spoke about it, with love, with respect, with a kind of pride that didn't shout but was woven into every word. As they walked, John kicked a small stone down the path and said, almost to himself, "It's been a long time since this house had laughter in it, since it felt like it was alive." He stopped walking, then glanced at her, "Until you two showed up." Emma stopped too. Her heart pounded in her ears. She didn't know what to say, so she didn't say anything. She just looked at him, and in that look, something passed between them, something neither of them fully understood yet but both felt. A connection that wasn't about saving or being saved. It was about something finding its place. And even though she didn't say it out loud in that moment, Emma knew this wasn't temporary anymore. Not for her, maybe not for him either. But life, in its unpredictable way, rarely lets peace settle for long. The very next morning, the calm that had embraced the ranch was broken. Shouts echoed through the fields, boots pounded against the dirt, and the workers were scattered in all directions. A bull had broken loose, one of the strongest on the ranch, and it was in a full panic, charging through fences, tossing its massive weight at anything in its path. John was the first to respond. Without thinking, he grabbed a rope and sprinted toward the chaos, barking out orders to the crew. "Corner him from the left. Keep distance. Don't let him double back." His voice was commanding, sharp, urgent. Emma stood on the porch, clutching Lily, her heart slamming in her chest as she watched it unfold. She had seen John in action before, but this was different. It was dangerous. Her instincts screamed at her to run out there, to help, to stop him. But her feet stayed planted as fear locked her in place. Then, in a split second that didn't feel real, The bull bucked, broke loose from the rope, and turned sharply toward John. The impact was brutal, a sound Emma would never forget, a sickening thud that seemed to silence the entire world. John's body flew several feet before hitting the ground hard, his hat landing yards away. "John!" Emma screamed, her voice raw, piercing. Everything around her faded. She didn't even realize she was running until she was already halfway across the field. Lily pressed tightly against her chest, her tears blurring her vision. When she reached him, John lay motionless, blood trickling from a deep gash on his forehead. His chest moved, barely. Emma dropped to her knees, her breath ragged. "No, no, no," she cried, grabbing his arm, shaking it. "Talk to me. Please, talk to me." The world around her blurred, voices yelling, someone shouting to call an ambulance, boots stomping, the distant sound of someone running toward the main house, but none of it registered. All Emma could see was John, pale, unmoving, broken. Her hands gripped his shirt, stained with dirt and blood, and she trembled so hard it felt like her body might give out. "You don't get to do this," she said, her voice breaking into pieces. "You don't get to leave. Not now, not after everything." Lily started crying too, a sharp wail that seemed to echo the panic ripping through Emma's chest. Her tears mixed with the blood on John's face as she gently cupped his cheeks. "You can't leave us," she whispered. "You can't leave me." And in that moment, in the raw, jagged pain of near loss, she felt something snap inside her, not in a breaking way, but like something falling free. She realized the fear in her chest wasn't just about losing a friend or a helper or even a good man. It was about losing him, the man who had become part of her days, who had stood next to her without asking for anything, who made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to live again. That kind of fear didn't come from nowhere. It came from love, and she loved him. She loved him in a way that was terrifying and sudden and undeniable, and all she could do now was hope that he would wake up, that this wasn't the end. She pressed her forehead to his, tears falling freely, whispering, "Stay with me, please. I don't know how to live without you." The sound of the ambulance siren grew louder in the distance, but all Emma could hear was her heartbeat pounding in her ears, counting down what felt like the last moments of a life she had only just begun to want again. The hospital smelled the same as it had days before, antiseptic and sorrow. Emma sat in the corner of the room in chair that felt more like a test of endurance than furniture. Her eyes locked on the man in the bed, John. He looked almost unrecognizable. His face was pale, bruised, and stitched. The bandage across his forehead hid the worst of the injury, but nothing could hide how fragile he looked now. Tubes ran from his arms, monitors beeped steadily beside him, and the rhythm of that sound was the only thing anchoring her. She hadn't let go of his hand since the nurses had let her in. Her fingers traced the calluses on his palm, remembering the strength in them, and it terrified her how cold and still they felt now. "Don't do this to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not you too." She laid her head gently on his chest, listening for the slow thump of his heartbeat, like it might answer her. She thought of everything they hadn't said, of all the things she hadn't realized until he was laying there unresponsive, how his silence had filled her days in the most comforting way, how his small gestures had made her feel like she mattered again. She lifted her head just enough to look at him, her thumb brushing the corner of his mouth. "I didn't see it coming," she said quietly. "I didn't expect you, and maybe that's why it hit so hard, because when something good finally showed up in her life again, the thought of losing it felt unbearable." Her tears soaked into the hospital blanket. "Please come back," she whispered, the words cracked and raw. "I need you. I'm not ready to say goodbye." Time stopped. The nurses came and went. The doctor checked his vitals, but Emma remained like a statue, unmoving, watching him, like if she looked away, he'd disappear. Lily slept in a small cot by the window, unaware of the storm inside her mother. Emma hadn't eaten, hadn't rested, not really. Every time someone tried to get her to lie down, she'd shake her head. "I'm not leaving," she'd say, and she meant it. She helped the nurses change his bandages, wiping away dried blood like she was cleaning something sacred. She told him stories even though his eyes never opened. About Lily's giggles, about how the orchard was starting to bloom again, about how she had learned to collect eggs without the hens pecking her hand. She told him all the things she didn't want to say when he was awake, hoping he might hear them now. "You'd be proud," she whispered once. "I didn't cry today when I fed the horses." She paused. "Okay, I cried a little, but I'm trying." The doctor came in one afternoon with a slight smile, flipping through the chart. "He's stable," he said. "That man of yours is tougher than he looks." And for the first time in days, Emma felt her knees give, not from fear, but from the release of it. She gripped the edge of the bed, her eyes flooding with tears again. But this time, they carried relief. She leaned down, pressed her lips to his hand, and whispered, "You did it. You came back." And this time, she didn't hold back the words that had lived on the edge of her heart for days. "I love you, John. I love you so much." And just when she thought he might not hear it, she felt it. The faintest squeeze of his fingers around hers. At first, she thought she'd imagined it, that small, almost imperceptible movement of his hand. But then it happened again. A gentle squeeze, faint but real, like his way of saying, "I'm still here." Emma's breath caught. Her eyes flew to his face, scanning it for any change. And then, slowly, his eyelids, fluttered. Not fully open, just enough to reveal the shimmer of life behind them. "Emma," he whispered, so quietly it felt more like a breath than a word. Her heart leapt to her throat. She leaned in closer, her hands cradling his face now, her tears falling faster. "I'm here," she said. "I'm right here." And then, barely audible but unmistakably real, he said it back. "I love you too." The moment shattered her, in the best way. She laughed and sobbed all at once, cupping his cheeks, trying to make sense of the wave crashing over her. "I thought I lost you," she cried. God, I didn't know I could hurt like that again." John gave the faintest smile, lopsided and full of pain, but full of truth too. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, wincing as he tried to breathe deeper. She pressed her forehead gently against his, whispering through her tears, "You scared the hell out of me." But even in that broken whisper, her words were drenched in love, the kind that only blooms after survival. They stayed like that for a long time, her holding his hand, her head close to his, the machine still beeping, but now sounding like a promise. He was going to live. He was staying. And Emma, who had once believed she'd never feel whole again, realized that in that hospital room, with Lily safe and John breathing beside her, she had found something she never thought she'd have again. A future. The days that followed weren't easy, but they were better. Emma never left John's side. She slept in that hard hospital chair with her head resting against the mattress, his hand in hers, as if letting go even for a second might undo everything. She watched his face for any signs of pain, read every expression, listened to every breath. When he drifted into deeper sleep, she stroked his hair gently, whispering stories of their days at the ranch, her voice soft like a lullaby. Lily, sensing the shift in her mother's energy, seemed calmer too, less fussy, more at peace, as if she knew everything was falling into place. Nurses continued to urge Emma to rest, to eat, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. "I will when he's better," she'd say, and no one pushed further. The doctor came in one morning with a rare smile and a slight lift of the brow. "He's stable," he confirmed. "If his progress keeps going like this, he'll be discharged soon." That word, discharged, felt like a balloon filling with air inside her chest. She sat back in the chair, stared at John's sleeping form, and finally allowed herself to breathe. Not the shallow, anxious kind she'd grown used to, but a deep, grounding breath that told her it was going to be okay. She leaned forward, kissed his knuckles, and whispered, "You did it, John. You fought your way back." And then, her voice broke again, gentler this time, "And I'm never leaving you. Not ever again." Outside the window, the sky had begun to clear, and the first warm streaks of sunlight pushed through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the bed. For the first time in weeks, Emma looked out at that light and didn't feel fear. She felt hope. When the hospital finally released John, it felt surreal to see him walking, slow, unsteady, but upright. Emma helped him into the truck, carefully guiding his movements while Lily sat in her car seat, babbling softly like she sensed the importance of the moment. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Not the heavy, uncertain kind of silence that had haunted their first ride together, but a reflective one. like each of them was holding something sacred inside their hearts. The truck rolled down the familiar gravel path, the scent of wet grass and earth wafting through the open windows. John kept one hand steady on the wheel, while the other, slowly and with intention, reached across to rest over Emma's. She looked down at their hands, his large worn one covering hers, and something in her chest stirred, deep and unspoken. He didn't look at her immediately, but when he did, there was something raw in his gaze. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice still rough with recovery. "When I was lying in that bed, when I didn't know if I'd come back, all I could think about was you and Lily, and how I couldn't go without telling you what you mean to me." Emma's breath caught. She turned to him fully, her eyes brimming again with that familiar mix of fear and love, and waited. John cleared his throat, his fingers tightening gently around hers. "I thought my heart was done, that it didn't have room left for anything after Sheena. But then you showed up, and you reminded me how to live again." His voice cracked, and he looked away, overwhelmed. But Emma didn't let go. She squeezed his hand, her touch saying everything her heart was still catching up to. The truck rolled to a slow stop along the side of the dirt road, just before the final bend that led to the house. John turned off the engine, and the world around them went quiet. Only the chirping of birds and the rustle of wind in the tall grass filled the air. He turned in his seat to face her, his eyes searching hers for something. Maybe permission, maybe courage. "Emma," he said again, softer this time. "You and Lily, you're my family now. And I know that might sound fast or crazy, but I don't care. I need you to know that I don't just want you here. I want a life with you." His voice trembled slightly, the vulnerability in it striking Emma harder than any romantic words ever could. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She had felt something growing between them for weeks now, through the quiet glances, the way he held Lily, the way he always made sure she felt safe. But hearing him say it, out loud, it made everything real. She reached up, brushing her fingers gently along his jaw, and whispered, "I never thought I could feel this again. Not after what I lost." Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. "But with you, I feel like I'm allowed to hope again. Like maybe, just maybe, I don't have to survive alone anymore." And then, without thinking, she leaned in. He met her halfway, and when their lips touched, it wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was soft, deep, and honest. A kiss that said everything neither of them had dared say before. When they finally pulled apart, he smiled, resting his forehead against hers. "We're going to build something good, Emma," he said. "I can feel it." And for the first time in years, she believed it too. Back at the ranch, life didn't return to normal. It became something new, something fuller. The rhythms of the farm picked up again, but now with laughter layered into the background, with Lily's giggles echoing across the fields, and Emma's voice calling out from the orchard as she picked apples, sometimes with John just a few steps behind her, offering quiet conversation or a teasing remark. The three of them had become something unspoken but undeniably real. John had recovered slowly, walking with a slight limp at first, but every step he took seemed stronger when Emma was nearby. And Lily, oh Lily, she was thriving. Her once fever-ravaged body was now full of boundless energy, her golden curls bouncing as she toddled after butterflies and chickens alike. One sunny afternoon, John stood in the corral holding her securely as he placed her gently onto Saul, the gentlest horse on the ranch. "Hold tight, little lady," he told her with that deep, playful voice. "Uncle John's got you." Emma watched from the porch, one hand covering her mouth, as her heart swelled. There was something about that moment, Lily laughing as John led her around the corral, the sun painting everything in gold, that made her chest ache with joy. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Thank you." It wasn't just gratitude for the present moment, but for all the pain that had somehow led to this, to them, to something she never thought she'd have again, a family. She wiped away a tear as she watched them, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. For the first time her past didn't feel like a chain around her neck. It felt like a story that had led her exactly where she was meant to be. As the weeks turned to months, the farm seemed to come alive in ways even John hadn't expected. The workers smiled more. There was music in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread, of lavender from the garden, of roasted vegetables and sun-warmed soil filled the air like something sacred. Emma had claimed her space, not by force but through care. She touched everything with quiet presence. Meals, gardens, hearts. John watched her in awe most days, still not quite believing how someone could walk into his life and make it bloom again. He found himself rearranging the house so she could reach the higher shelves, fixing a swing on the porch for Lily, planting new roses along the edge of the garden just because she once mentioned they were her favorite. Emma, in turn, never made him feel like he had to change. She just showed up, fully, honestly, and somehow that made him want to be better. Every now and then, they would sit in the quiet of the evening, Lily already tucked into bed, sipping tea or sharing stories they hadn't told before. Stories of loss, of childhood, of the things they missed, and the things they feared. And through those stories, a deep trust grew, not built on fairy tales or perfect moments, but on real ones, the kind where someone holds your hand even when your scars are showing. Emma often found herself lying awake at night, not out of worry, but wonder. How had this happened? How had a moment of pure desperation turned into something this whole? But every time she started to doubt it, to question if she deserved it, John would reach over, wrap his arm around her waist and pull her close. And in that silent embrace, she'd remember, some miracles arrive quietly. Some don't feel like magic. They feel like home. Then came Christmas Eve, and with it, a magic that didn't need fairy tales to be felt. The ranch, transformed under strings of warm yellow lights, handmade wreaths on every wooden post, and the giant tree in the center of the lawn glowing with red and gold. The smell of cinnamon, roasted meats, and freshly baked cheese bread drifted from the kitchen and into the open air, mixing with the earthy scent of pine and the chill of the December breeze. Everyone came. Ranch workers, neighbors, villagers who'd once kept their distance but now felt like part of the same heartbeat. Emma stood with Lily, in her arms, dressed in a simple red sweater, her cheeks flushed from the cold and the emotion that hummed beneath her skin. John had spent all week preparing the space, but now he stood awkwardly near the small wooden platform they'd built beside the tree. He cleared his throat, adjusted his hat, and stepped up to the microphone. The crowd quieted. Even the crickets seemed to hush. "Thank you," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for being here, for being part of something that I didn't think I'd have again." His eyes scanned the crowd, landing on Emma, and his words changed. "Life doesn't always give us what we expect. Sometimes it takes things away so fast we can't even breathe. But sometimes it gives us new beginnings, unexpected ones, beautiful ones." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small blue velvet box, and dropped to one knee. The world stopped. Emma's heart leapt into her throat. "Emma," he said, his voice cracking, "will you marry me?" The air filled with gasps, with the sound of 100 hearts holding their breath. Emma's tears spilled before she could speak. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." The applause broke out like thunder rolling over the hills. Claps, cheers, whistles, and even a few tears from the crowd who had witnessed something so raw, so true, it felt like it belonged to all of them. But as Emma ran to John, cradling Lily in one arm and wrapped the other around his neck, the world faded. It was just them, just her and this man who had carried her through her darkest hour and brought her back into the light. She bent down, her forehead touching his, and whispered with a trembling breath, "There's more." His eyes widened as he searched her face. "I'm pregnant," she said, barely able to speak through her tears. The world around them blurred, and for a second, John didn't move, frozen not from shock, but from the overwhelming force of joy crashing through him. And then he laughed like he hadn't in years, loud and free and full of something only the truly reborn know. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground, spinning her as the snow began to fall lightly, tiny flakes catching in her hair, melting on his beard. "You've given me everything," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Everything I thought I'd lost forever." Around them, the crowd celebrated, but in that moment, John and Emma were alone in a world made new. Lily clapped her little hands and squealed, and Emma kissed John's cheek, then his lips, again and again, like she couldn't believe he was real. And maybe that was the truth. Maybe love like this didn't feel real until it was right in front of you, holding you up when the world had tried to break you. And in that moment, under the lights, the snow, and 1,000 eyes, they both knew. This wasn't just a love story. This was the beginning of everything. The months that followed seemed to pass both slowly and all at once. The ranch was no longer just a place of work or shelter. It became a home in every sense of the word. Emma, now visibly pregnant, moved through the space like she had always belonged there, her hands brushing over cabinets, touching freshly picked herbs, arranging flowers from the garden like each act stitched her closer to the life she was building. Lily, stronger than ever, ran across the fields with the kind of wild joy only children carry, her golden hair flying behind her, her laugh echoing louder than the birds. She had grown attached to the horses, especially Saul, who stood patiently every time she reached out with her tiny hands, whispering secrets only a child could understand. John had become something else entirely, not just a man in love, but a father in every sense of the word. He was the one who ran after Lily when she got too close to the corral, who knelt beside her to help her plant her first sunflower, who lifted her high into the air and spun her until they both collapsed in. The grass, laughing like the weight of the past, no longer held them, and Emma would watch them from the porch, one hand resting on her belly, the other pressed to her heart, overwhelmed by how full it all felt. The pain hadn't disappeared, grief didn't vanish, but it had changed shape. It no longer defined them. It lived quietly in the corners, a reminder of what had been lost, but also of how much had been found. And on quiet nights, when John kissed her forehead and whispered, "I still can't believe you're here," Emma would smile softly and think, "Me neither." It wasn't just love that had filled the ranch. It was purpose. Emma started organizing little community dinners, inviting neighbors who had once kept their distance to share stories and warm food under the stars. The ranch hands, once polite but reserved, now called her boss lady with smiles and easy laughter. And John, who had spent years moving through his days with quiet isolation, found himself part of something again. He didn't just manage the land anymore. He nurtured it, shared it, opened it up the way he had opened his heart. And with each passing day, the house felt less like a place haunted by memories and more like a living, breathing part of something new. One evening, as spring crept into the air and the orchard started to bloom, John and Emma sat on the porch swing, Lily asleep inside, the stars stretching out above them. "You ever think about how this all started?" Emma asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "Every day," John replied, his arm wrapped securely around her. "One desperate night," she murmured. "One fever, one stranger opening a gate." She turned her head slightly to look up at him. It changed everything. He looked back at her, eyes soft. "I didn't save you, Emma. You saved me too." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "No," she said quietly. "We saved each other." And as they sat there, wrapped in the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled, the night held them gently. The ranch around them, the trees swaying softly in the wind, the creak of the swing beneath them. It all became part of a rhythm, a heartbeat, a new beginning that neither of them had expected, but now couldn't imagine living without. As the months rolled into summer, the ranch radiated with a quiet kind of joy that couldn't be faked. It was in the way Lily ran barefoot through the fields, shrieking with laughter as John chased after her with a straw hat in hand, pretending to be a monster. It was in the way Emma moved through the kitchen, humming softly, her belly round, one hand always resting there protectively, as if already comforting the life growing inside her. Even the animals seemed to sense the change. The horses were calmer, the dogs followed Emma like shadows, and the birds nested closer to the porch, as if the house itself had become safer. Emma spent most mornings outside, watching the sunrise with a warm cup of tea, the kind of peace she used to think only existed in books. But it was real. It was hers. And as she watched John carry Lily on his shoulders, her tiny fingers gripping his hair while he laughed and called her the boss of the farm, Emma felt something so pure and overwhelming it nearly brought her to tears. Gratitude. Not the surface kind, but the kind that settles in your bones, the kind that humbles you. She knew what it meant to be without, to sit in darkness, to beg for help with no one listening. That's why every moment now felt sacred. She never took it for granted. Not the safety, not the love, not even the hard days when she was tired or sore or scared about becoming a mother again. Because even in those moments, she wasn't alone. She had John. She had Lily. She had something she never expected to find again, a future that didn't feel borrowed, but truly hers. On the day the baby arrived, the ranch buzzed with a nervous kind of anticipation. The sky was clear, the air hot, the scent of wildflowers carried in the wind. Emma had gone into labor just before dawn, and John had flown into motion like a man on a mission, calling the midwife, preparing the room, barking gentle but urgent instructions at the ranch hands, who were too flustered to do much but nod. Lily had been scooped up by one of the neighbor women, babbling excitedly that she was going to be a big sister. Inside the house, everything slowed down. Emma's breaths came sharp and heavy, sweat beading on her forehead, her hands gripping the sheets as each contraction hit like a wave. John stayed by her side the entire time, never once letting go of her hand, even when she crushed it so hard his knuckles turned white. "You've got this," he whispered again and again, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "You're the strongest person I know." And Emma, through the pain, through the fear, believed him. Hours passed like minutes and days all at once, until finally a cry pierced the room, a sharp, perfect, newborn wail that stopped everything. Emma collapsed back against the pillows, sobbing with relief, her heart exploding as they placed a tiny baby boy in her arms. John kissed her forehead, tears running down his face, his voice cracking as he said, "You did it. He's here. You brought him home." And as she looked into that baby's face, his tiny nose, his scrunched up eyes, she felt it again, that quiet, unwavering certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. This love, this life, this family, it had saved her. The ranch felt different after the baby was born. Slower, quieter, but somehow even more alive. They named him Caleb, and from the very first moment, it was clear he was already wrapped in more love than most people get in a lifetime. Lily hovered around him constantly, proudly announcing to every visitor, animal, or passing bird that this was her baby brother. Emma spent long afternoons on the porch, Caleb cradled against her chest, watching Lily play in the grass, while John repaired fences or tended to the animals. Sometimes he'd glance up, catch her watching him, and just smile. Not the kind of smile people give when they're being polite, but the kind that says, "I see you, I love you, and I'm not going anywhere." Emma would smile back, her heart full in ways she still struggled to put into words. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving, about building a home not from bricks and lumber, but from laughter, trust, and second chances. There were hard moments, of course, sleepless nights, tantrums, exhaustion, but even those felt bearable when shared. And more than anything, Emma found herself waking each day not with dread or fear, but with purpose, with hope, with gratitude. She had once run barefoot down a gravel road, desperate, broken, holding a dying child. Now, she walked those same paths with her head high and her hands full, not of burden, but of blessings. Every evening, after the children were asleep, Emma and John would sit together outside, the porch swing creaking beneath them, stars blooming above like scattered wishes. Sometimes they talked about crops, about stories from John's childhood, about Lily's new obsession with naming every chicken. Sometimes they just sat in silence, holding hands, listening to the wind. But no matter how the day had gone, whether it had been hard or simple or beautiful, they always ended it the same way, together. One night, as a cool breeze drifted through the orchard, Emma leaned her head on John's shoulder and whispered, "Do you ever think about that day? The one when everything changed?" He nodded. "Every single day." She turned her face toward him, her voice barely a breath. "I still don't know how I made it to your gate." He looked down at her, his eyes filled with something that went beyond love, something closer to awe. "You didn't," he said softly. "You were carried by something bigger than both of us." She didn't reply. She didn't have to, because in her heart, she knew he was right. That day, that run, that desperate plea, it had led her here. To him, to Lily's laughter, to Caleb's peaceful breathing, to this home, this life, this love that had made the impossible real. Sometimes when Emma lay awake at night, the old fear crept in like a whisper. What if it all disappeared again? What if it was all too good to last? But then she'd turn and see John sleeping beside her, one hand resting gently on Caleb's bassinet, the other still tangled in hers. And that fear would dissolve, not because bad things couldn't happen, but because she knew now she didn't have to face them alone. And that changed everything. There was a strength in that, an armor not made of steel but of shared moments, honest words, and the promise that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. Emma didn't need grand declarations anymore. She didn't need perfection. She just needed real. And that's what she had found. A man who saw her past and didn't flinch. A life that had risen from the ashes. A love that didn't ask her to forget where she came from, but gave her somewhere new to go. Years from now, Emma would sit with her children on that same porch, telling them the story of how their family began, not with fairy dust or destiny, but with desperation, with courage, with a single knock on a wooden gate and a man who chose to open it. She would tell them how love doesn't always arrive with fireworks, but sometimes with a whisper, with a blanket, wrapped around a sick baby, with a stranger's arms holding you steady when you're falling apart. And as she told that story, over and over, because they'd beg for it every time, she'd look out at the fields, at the house, at the life they'd built, and she'd still feel the same quiet wonder she'd felt the very first time John said, "You're not alone anymore," because it never stopped being true. Emma never could quite explain how it all happened. Even now, years later, when people asked how she got here, how she found love again, how she rebuilt a life from nothing, she'd smile softly, shrug a little and say, "It all started with a sick baby and a rancher who didn't turn me away." But the truth went deeper. It started with surrender, with one moment of raw, unfiltered truth. And what came after, what grew from that pain, was something so rare, so beautiful, it still caught her breath when she thought about it. That kind of love doesn't come often, and when it does, it doesn't always look like you'd expect. But when it arrives, real and raw and wrapped in second chances, it stays. It roots itself. It changes everything. And in Emma's case, it saved not just her daughter, not just her heart, but her entire future. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary stories begin in the most ordinary places, with an open gate, a desperate knock, and someone willing to say, "Come in."